Rush is the story of James Hunt, Niki Lauda. It's directed by Ron Howard. There's been quite a lot of interesting stuff in the trade press about where the funding and everything comes from. People say it's British production, 80% British stuff, and then, a Hollywood sheen. There's also a German production element. But it's written by Peter Morgan, who, of course, wrote Frost Nixon, which was a stage play, and then was adapted by Ron Howard, which I liked very much. And the story is essentially of these two Formula One drivers who are chalk and cheese, completely, you couldn't get two more different people. One of them is very much a sort of the British player, James Hunt, is very much the British playboy. He actually wears a badge which says Sex, Breakfast of Champions, and apparently that is historically accurate. He romps around with, nurses and stewardesses in a very kind of Austin Powers way. The other, Niki Lauda, is Austrian, very, very sort of, internalised and focused on the main goal and doesn't believe in going out and partying and, believes in doing everything sort of silent. And essentially what the movie does, it plays those two personalities off against each other. One chalk, one cheese, one hot, one cool, one enormously likeable, one quite distant, and then puts them together on a racetrack and off the racetrack and watches the sparks fly. Here's a clip.
5 races in. How's it going so far?
It's fine. Just got a little problem with an Austrian rat and his team of Italian cheats who've destroyed my car.
What are you talking about?
Talking about the race in Spain that I won.
Yeah, in a car, which is not legal.
5/8 of an inch too wide. You know that doesn't have the slightest effect on speed. But you complained and your team have always leaned on the authorities. Now we've had to rebuild the car and it's become a monster.
At least it's a legal monster.
So you've had to resort to cheating.
You're driving an illegal car and call me the cheat? It's pathetic. Rules are rules.
Yes. And rats are rats. Thank you. Thank you.
Do you really think it upsets me, James? Calling me a rat? Because I look like one? I don't mind it. Rats are ugly, sure, and nobody likes them. But they're very intelligent, and they have a strong survival instinct.
Wonderful.
So you can hear there, it clearly, in a way, that sort of sets up exactly the opposition. One of them is, kind of free and crazy and lovable, and the other one is, I have a very strong survival instinct. I don't mind that you call me a rat, because... And that's basically the heart of the film. Now, it's impossible to watch any feature film about Formula One without thinking of Formula One in which you have two characters who are sort of chalk and cheese, who are, hot and cold, without thinking, obviously, about Senna. And I absolutely loved Senna, the documentary that Asif Kapadia made. Of course, Senna wasn't, widely seen in America. It didn't have, great sort of mainstream traction. And also it was overlooked at the Oscar nominations, which was a real scandal, because over here it got, it got 2 BAFTAs. And one of the questions is always, how much will an American audience get the thing about Formula One? I don't know much about Formula One at all. I know that you took me to a Formula One race once and it just completely befuddled me.
We did the show from there. That's what when I took you, we actually did the programme.
I thought it was a date.
Well, for me, it was a programme. I'm sorry if you misinterpreted it.
Thank you. But it was, it was very much a foreign world for me. But Formula One has a kind of, there's an awareness of it here that there isn't across the Atlantic. So what Ron Howard has tried to do, and what Peter Morgan's tried to do as well, is to take a subject that, some of those mainstream audiences may see and make it as mainstream acceptable as possible. And that means very broad brushstrokes. That means that the differences between the characters are really saying, so Chris Hemsworth playing James Hunt pretty much as he's playing Thor. He's just rampagingly attractive and, thunder god and all the rest of it. And Niki Lauda is that in that clip in which he says, I don't mind you say I look like a rat. Yes, well, rats are right. And he does all that stuff. I understand why that happens. One of the problems for me is that sometimes the brushstrokes are too bald, and particularly when we get to the commentary. And I think you had the same thing, which is that the racing commentary does occasionally feel...
Tells you exactly what's happening.
It's being delivered by Basil
Exposition. But it's for people like you who don't get Formula One.
Well... Okay, well, here's what I would say. I would say that I didn't need it, and I felt that the radio commentary was over-egged and that it was too explanatory. And I sort of bridle against anything in which movies feel the need to explain themselves to me. But Ron Howard has a very, very popular touch, and clearly he understands that in his mind there is a certain section of the audience that is going to need that level of explaining. I also think that kind of real black and white, clear brushstrokes thing divides the characters in a way that, yes, it's fun. I understand it sets up the tension, but occasionally it's too much for me. Occasionally, for me, it felt too much like the movie telling you what is going on and people explaining things to you, which is always something about which I have a problem. That said, even with that happening, the movie works, and the reason it works is, firstly, it is a good sort of fire and ice story, with the lukewarm water in the middle. It has very strong performances. I think Chris Hemsworth's accent kind of, sort of wanders all over the place because, every now and then doing the sort of, the posh James Hunt thing, he does go a little bit Neighbours every now and then. But Christian McKay, I think, is really, really good. Actually, I think he's a really good actor, and we haven't seen enough of him since he was in, Me and Orson Welles, in which he played Orson Welles. At some point, we're going to see him play Churchill, I think, because he's a really sort of fine actor. But the film is directed by somebody who understands, firstly, the mainstream audience, and secondly, has a real love of cars and racing. Because you look back at Ron Howard's back catalogue, and you look at Grand Theft Auto, and you look at the fact that he starred in American Graffiti, which has all that sort of love of drive-ins and nostalgia. And the soundtrack is absolutely thrilling. You sit there, and it's the thing that puts you right in the driver's seat, is all that.
And my goodness me, you're going to do all the sound effects.
No, I can't do all of the sound effects. But I think you've thought the same thing, was that even if you have reservations about the very, very clear through lines of the story, which felt slightly artificial to me, although I know that the true story is not a million miles away from that, all that stuff about once you're in the car, the race sequences are terrifying. I mean, really properly terrifying. You do get that sense of people doing something which is completely dangerous, like really, really properly, even despite the sort of the off-track meetings about we can't race in these conditions because these conditions are too dangerous. And, Anthony Dobmantle's camera is sort of zooming in and out of the car and through the wheels and into the thing and in through the helmets, all the rest of it. But it's that sound, it's that bass line, it's that pulsing bass line that absolutely, grips you. And funnily enough, there's a part of me which feels the same way about it that I did about Time, which is that you have the intellectual part of you and the emotional part of you, and part of the intellect is going, it's too explanatory, it's too clear, it's too black and white. But the emotional part of you is going, yeah, but I'm travelling at about 100 miles an hour around a track, and I'm actually really interested in the way these characters spark off each other. So I think it is something that is drawn very clearly, and it is something that is playing to the grandstand. But that's what Howard does. I mean, Howard is a very successful populist director, and he does. I mean, I think there are exceptions to that. I think if you look at some of his movies, like Da Vinci Code or Dilemma, he does drop the ball occasionally, but he basically plays to the mainstream crowd. And I mean, I could see this doing well at the American box office, even though they fundamentally don't have the same relationship with Formula One that we do. And it is something which is driven by the tension between those two characters, as opposed, in the end, the cars and everything are sort of window dressing to.
They are fantastically unlikable characters, aren't they? I mean,
do you think both of them are?
I thought James Hunt and Niki Lauda both kept me thinking, well, I wouldn't want to spend much time with either of these
guys. Because he's so full of himself, and because Niki Lauda is so hard to
hard to like and doesn't really care and is very cold and emotionless. And I did think that James Hunt comes over a little bit cartoony, a little bit storybooky, but
that's what I mean. He comes over as Thor.
Yes,
he does. He does, because the first time you see him, he comes into, it's not the very first time, he walks into this hospital with his sort of, his overalls, whatever it is, he's wearing ripped, and he's kind of, and the nurse looks at him, and you can almost hear something go, wah, wah, wah. And he says, what's happened to you? Well, I got into a fight with who? It was with somebody's husband. What did you do? Well, I'll show you. I mean, that is carry-on nurse style of humour. And that's what I mean by it being, a bit Austin Powers. But those broad strokes make me kind of go, okay, I'm sort of stepping away from credibly engaging with this. But at the same time, the other part of you is going, yeah, but actually, isn't that interesting? He's hot-headed, he's really cool, he's kind of passionate, he's really calculating. They've got these very different relationships with their nearest and dearest. And then you get into the cars and the race. I mean, how did you feel about the race sequences?
Well, they were extremely scary, but they're also, again, it sort of ties in a little bit with Senna, is because I think most people will know that there's a bad thing coming up.
I didn't.
Do you not? Well,
I didn't, and I,
But they do set it up at the beginning. It's the start of a race, and then they cut back to a few years before. So I think that they are particularly terrifying because the slogan, the catchphrase which we mentioned last week, when sex was safe and driving was dangerous, that's it. That's where it was, and you marvel at how little regard they had for driver safety, because the conditions at the Nürburgring, the way it's portrayed in the film,
absolutely
genuinely scary.
Absolutely terrifying. Although I have to, I mean, again, I know it's always difficult talking about plot spoilers when you're talking about a movie about real life, but I remember, and I'll say this again, with watching Apollo 13, which was the Ron Howard movie, about Apollo 13. I remember sitting there with Wendy Lloyd. I know I've told this story before, but it does, and Wendy Lloyd at the end of it going, wow, I didn't know how it ended. How could you not know how Apollo 13 ended? Well, I knew very, very little about this. The same way I knew nothing about Senna and Alain Prost before watching Asif Kapadia's work, which I still think, for me, Senna is the uber text here, and this is like one removed from that. But if you're going to do that, okay, let's take the complexities, the intricacies, the real sort of thematic meat of Senna and sort of deal with a similar subject, but do it in a much more mainstream way. it makes perfect sense for somebody like Ron Howe to do it and say, OK, I am looking at the grandstand. I've got my eye on the final flag all the way through. I mean, I think you do come out going, blimey.